Here is a number that should not have been possible in 1939. In the time it takes the best trained infantryman in the world, a man with the finest bolt-action rifle ever built, to fire one aimed shot, drop the rifle from his shoulder, work the bolt, and bring the sights back on target. The American beside him has fired 2, sometimes 3. He never lifts his hand from the trigger. 8 rounds, as fast as his finger can move, every one of them aimed. Now multiply that by the man to his left and the one to his right, by the squad, by the company. Every other major army marched to war in 1939. With a rifle, a soldier had to work by hand between each shot. The United States marched to war with a rifle that reloaded itself. This is the story of the M1 Garand, how a Canadian-born toolmaker spent 17 years solving a problem every other nation on earth had tried and abandoned, and put into the hands of the ordinary American infantryman the single largest firepower advantage any rifleman carried in the Second World War. And it is the story of the myth that grew up around its most famous sound, the one that says all that firepower came with a fatal price built right into the design. To understand what the Garand actually changed, forget the rifle for a minute and look at the arithmetic of a firefight. Every other army that went to war in 1939 carried a bolt-action rifle. The German Kar 98K, the British Lee Enfield, the Japanese Arisaka, the Soviet Mosin, superb weapons, accurate, rugged, deadly in trained hands. And every one of them shared the same fundamental limit. After each shot, the rifleman had to break his firing position, take a hand off the grip, lift the bolt, drag it back, shove it forward, turn it down, and only then settle the sights again. It takes a second or two. It doesn't sound like much. On a range, it isn't. In a firefight, that second or two is everything. A well-drilled soldier with a bolt action could put perhaps 15 aimed rounds downrange in a minute. A man with a Garand could deliver 2 to 3 times that, not by spraying, but by firing, recovering from the recoil, and firing again, with the rifle doing all the work of reloading in between. The sights barely leave the target. The volume of aimed fire that one rifleman could generate roughly doubled overnight. Now stop thinking about one rifleman. A rifle squad is 10 or 12 men. A company is well over 100. When every one of them can fire twice as fast, the firepower a unit can throw in the critical opening seconds of a contact, the seconds that decide who takes cover and who takes the ground, doesn't just add up, it compounds. This is the thing to hold on to for the rest of this story, because it is the whole reason the rifle mattered. The Garand was not a wonder weapon. It did not shoot straighter than a Lee Enfield or hit harder than a Kar 98K. It fired the same class of cartridge as every rifle it faced. Its single advantage was that it loaded itself, and that one advantage, multiplied across every squad in the US Army, was one of the quietest and most decisive edges any soldier carried into the war. There is an honest complication here, and we will come back to it. The German infantry squad wasn't built around its rifle at all, but around its machine gun, which is a different way of solving the same problem. Hold that thought. Because first there is a harder question. If a self-loading rifle was such an obvious advantage, why did every other nation on earth try to build one for their infantries and give up? To answer that, we have to go back to a workbench in Massachusetts, and a man who was not a soldier, not an arms designer, and by every reasonable expectation, the wrong person entirely for the job. His name was John Cantius Garand, and he made his living shaping metal. He was born on a farm in Quebec on the first day of 1888, Canadian, one of a large family that moved to the United States when he was a boy. He was not an engineer with a degree. He was not an officer. He was a machinist, a toolmaker, a man who had worked factory floors since childhood and understood in his hands, more than on paper, how metal parts move against one another. He taught himself mechanisms the way other men learn a language they grow up speaking. That instinct is the reason his name is on the most famous American rifle of the century, and the reason it took him 17 years to get it there. Garand came to the government's Springfield Armory in 1919 at the end of the First World War with a self-loading design in his head. The Army had just watched 4 years of massed infantry combat and knew exactly what it wanted. A rifle that could fire as fast as a man could aim without the bolt. What it did not have, what nobody had, was a design rugged enough, reliable enough, and simple enough to hand to millions of ordinary soldiers and trust in the mud. His first designs, through the early 1920s, ran on a clever principle that used the backward push of the cartridge primer to cycle the action. They worked until the Army changed its gunpowder, and the new propellant made the whole approach unworkable overnight. Years of effort undone by a decision made in another building? Garand did not argue. He went back to the bench and redesigned the rifle around a completely different idea, tapping the gas from the fired cartridge to drive the mechanism. That decision, forced on him by a setback, put him on the path to the rifle the world would remember. And here is the detail worth holding because it tells you who he was. Every one of those millions of rifles, every M1 that would be stamped out, issued, carried up a beach and through a hedgerow, earned John Garand nothing beyond his government salary. He held the patents and he signed the rights over to the United States. He took no royalties. Several million rifles bore his name and his labor, and he never made a dollar from a single one of them. He thought of it as work for the country and left it at that. But a good idea on a workbench is not a service rifle. Before the Garand could win a war, it had to survive a war of its own. A decade of trials, rival designs, and one intervention from a general that nearly sent Garand back to the drawing board for good. A good idea on a workbench is not a service rifle. Before the army would put Garand's design in a single soldier's hands, it had to win a competition, and for most of a decade, it kept losing. One name deserves to be said out loud here because almost nobody says it. Every rifle in this story was built by a man who never made a dollar from it. John Garand signed his patents over to the United States and lived on a government machinist's wage while millions of rifles bearing his name went out the door. If there's one thing this channel exists to do, it's put people like him back into the stories the legends leave out. And a like is the simplest way to push this toward the people who still care about names like his. Anyway, by the early 1930s, the contest for America's first self-loading service rifle had come down to two men, both named John. One was Garand, the quiet toolmaker with his gas-operated action. The other was John Peterson, a celebrated, well-connected designer whom much of the ordnance establishment considered the safer bet. His rifle was a beautiful piece of work, a delayed blowback action that folded shut on a hinged toggle like a Luger scaled up to a rifle. On paper, plenty of men favored it over the farm boy machinist's design. And here is the detail most telling skip. Both rifles, Garand's and Peterson's, were built around the same cartridge, and it was not the 30-06. It was a new round, the 276 Peterson, shorter, lighter, with less than half the recoil of the old 30-06, and gentle enough on a mechanism that it made building a reliable autoloader dramatically easier. Both rifles fed from 10-round clips. For a while, the future of the American rifle was a 276 with 10 rounds in the magazine, and the only question was whose action would carry it. Peterson's rifle had one flaw, and it was fatal. To make the toggle work, every cartridge had to be coated in a thin, dry wax. Lubricated ammunition is a quartermaster's nightmare. Wax attracts grit, and no one seriously believed the average infantryman would keep his rounds clean through a war. Garand's gas system needed no such trick. It ran on dry ammunition the way a rifle should. Peterson didn't help his own case. Where Garand stayed at the bench and gave his rights away, Peterson wanted a royalty on every rifle built and annoyed the very board deciding his fate. At the critical moment, with the army wanting him present for trials, he was in Europe trying to sell his design to the British. Still, it was close. In October 1931, the Garand's bolt cracked during firing and the rifle was pulled from testing. Within weeks, the board was leaning toward Peterson's cartridge and Peterson's rifle. An improved Garand clawed back ahead the next year. The thing seesawed. Then it was settled in a single stroke by a man who never fired a shot in the trial. In February 1932, the Army Chief of Staff, General Douglas MacArthur, killed the 276 outright. Keep the 30-06, he ordered. The reasons had nothing to do with ballistics and everything to do with money and mountains of it. The country was sliding into the Depression, and the army already sat on a colossal stockpile of 30-06 left over from the First World War, with every machine gun it owned chambered to match. To buy a new rifle and a new cartridge at the same time was a bill Congress would never pay. That decision is still argued over, and it deserves to be argued honestly. The 276 was very likely the better round, lighter, softer, 10 to a clip, and MacArthur's call cost the American infantryman a better cartridge and 2 rounds of capacity, but it may also have saved the entire program. A divisive new cartridge in 1932 could have stalled the self-loading rifle for years and left the GY waiting ashore in 1944 with a bolt action after all. Garand, characteristically, had seen it coming. He already had a version chambered for the 30-06 in hand. When the redesign was finished, the fat old cartridge fit 8 to a clip instead of 10, and so that number 8, the quirk every account of the M1 puzzles over, is really a fossil of a general's budget decision in 1932. Every soldier who ever reached for a 9th round he didn't have was quietly paying MacArthur's bill. The rifle went to field trials in 1934, was cleared in late 1935, and on January the 9th, 1936, was adopted as the U.S. rifle caliber 30 M1. America became the first great power on earth to make a self-loading rifle the standard arm of its infantry. Now it only had to work. So open the hood. Every rifle before the Garand asked the same thing of the soldier. Your muscle reloads the weapon. Lift the bolt, pull, push, turn. Your hand does the work between every shot. Garand's rifle asked nothing. It stole a little of the explosion that fired each bullet and spent it reloading itself, and it did that 8 times over without the soldier moving anything but his trigger finger. Whether the M1 was a triumph or a curiosity came down to one question. Could that trick be made reliable enough to hand to a 19-year-old and trust in the mud? Here is how it works. When the rifle fires, the bullet races up the barrel, and just before the muzzle, it passes a small port drilled in the underside. A jet of high-pressure gas bleeds through that port into a cylinder below and shoves back a piston. That piston is the front end of a long steel rod, the operating rod, that runs the length of the rifle back to the bolt. It wasn't always so simple. Garand's first rifles used a more elaborate gas trap, a fitting at the very muzzle that caught the gas only after the bullet had already left, which actually made those early rifles superbly accurate. But it was fragile, especially with the bayonet fixed, and it fouled with carbon. In early 1939, with a war visibly coming, Garand and the Springfield engineers threw it out and drilled the simple port instead. Most of the earlier rifles were recalled and rebuilt. Reliability beat elegance. It would not be the last time he made that trade. Follow the operating rod back and you reach the cleverest part. As the rod drives rearward, a slot machined into it catches a lug on the bolt and twists it. The bolt rotates, its 2 locking lugs turn out of their recesses and the breech unlocks. Only now, with the pressure safely dropped, does the bolt travel back. It drags the spent case out, flings it clear, and cocks the hammer on the way. Then a single spring, and this is pure Garand economy, drives everything forward again, stripping a fresh round from the magazine, chambering it, and in the last fraction of an inch, camming the bolt around into lock. One spring runs the whole cycle. The same spring even works the magazine follower. Nothing is wasted. And the magazine is where the rifle earns both its genius and its arguments. The M1 takes no box magazine you swap out. It takes an en-bloc clip, a stamped steel frame holding 8 rounds in 2 staggered columns of 4. You press the whole loaded clip down into the open action with your thumb, and the clip stays inside the rifle, its own steel walls serving as the lips that guide each round up. The bolt feeds off it, round after round, until the 8th is gone. And then a little spring-loaded arm kicks the empty clip up and out of the receiver with a bright metallic ring. That sound is the ping. We will come back to it because almost everything most people think they know about it is wrong. That speed carried a small, painful price the design never hid. Pressing the clip down releases the bolt, so if your thumb is still in the way when the clip seats, the full force of the spring drives the bolt forward onto it. Generations of soldiers learned that the hard way and gave it a name, Garand thumb. The Army's own manual tells you to seat the clip with the edge of your hand blocking the bolt. The rifle that reloaded itself would, given the chance, bite the hand that fed it. Stand back from all of it and the real achievement isn't cleverness. Plenty of designers were clever. It's discipline. At every fork, Garand chose the rugged answer over the refined one. A full-power gas stroke that would cycle filthy and frozen, dry ammunition. A clip that was part of the mechanism instead of a fragile detachable box. He built a self-loading rifle simple enough and strong enough to put in the hands of millions of ordinary men and trust in surf, snow, and volcanic sand. That, not the ping, not the 8 rounds, is the engineering that mattered. Because a mechanism is only a promise on paper, and this one was about to be handed to teenagers on opposite sides of the planet and asked to keep its promise under fire. The promise met the world on a jungle island. The M1 first went into serious combat in the Pacific in 1942 on Guadalcanal and the islands after it, carried by men who had trained on the rifle but never fought with it. Some American units were still shouldering the old bolt-action Springfield in those early campaigns. The changeover wasn't finished until 1944, when both the army and the marines were fully equipped. But wherever the Garand appeared, the enemy noticed at once. Here is what it felt like from the other side. A soldier with a bolt action fires, then ducks. He has to, because working the bolt means dropping out of his aim for a second or two. A GI with a Garand fires, rides the recoil and fires again, sights never leaving the target. In the time a Japanese or German rifleman got off one shot and cycled for a second, the American across from him sent 3. Multiply that down a firing line, and the imbalance was so stark that German accounts spoke of American squads as though every man carried a machine gun. The volume simply didn't match what a line of riflemen was supposed to make. In the Pacific, it changed how the enemy fought. The massed banzai charge, meant to overrun a position in a single rush, ran into a wall of aimed, continuous fire it had never been built to face, and turned steadily more suicidal against troops who didn't have to pause to reload. On the advance, the rifle enabled a tactic Patton himself named marching fire. Rather than stop to shoot, American infantry could walk forward, putting accurate rounds into anything that might hide an enemy, keeping his head down the whole way in. A bolt-action army could not do that. A self-loading one could. And it kept working. The reliability Garand had traded elegance for paid off in surf, in volcanic sand, in Ardennes snow. A soldier could strip the entire rifle for cleaning using the rim of a cartridge as his only tool. It ran dirty, it ran cold. For the men who carried it, that mattered as much as the firepower. The rifle that reloaded itself also, mostly, went on doing it when everything around it was filthy and frozen. So the arithmetic from the start of this story turned out to be real. The Garand gave the individual American infantryman fire superiority over the individual man shooting back at him. No wonder weapon, but a genuine, repeatable edge handed to every rifleman in the force at once. But honesty demands a caveat here, and it's the one the experts are waiting for. This was an advantage of the individual rifle, and wars are not fought by individual rifles. The German infantry squad wasn't built around its riflemen at all. It was built around its machine gun, the fearsome MG-42, with the riflemen there to feed and protect it. Round for round, a German squad could throw out more fire than an American one. The two armies had simply answered the same question in opposite ways. One put a self-loader in every man's hands, the other concentrated its firepower in a single belt-fed gun. Which answer was better is an argument that has never entirely ended and will come back to it. The Garand's greatness is real, but it lived at the level of the man, not always the squad. One thing still stands between us and the verdict, though. It's the single most famous fact about the M1, the sound it made when the last round left the barrel. Nearly everyone knows what that sound supposedly cost a man, and nearly everyone is wrong. Every rifle in this story makes noise when it fires. Only one of them is remembered for the noise it makes when it stops. When a GI fired his 8th and last round, the mechanism did something no other service rifle did. A spring-loaded arm inside the receiver flung the empty steel clip up and out, along with the final spent case, and the clip rang as it went. A bright, high, unmistakable ping like a struck bell. And attached to that one sound is the most famous story ever told about the M1 Garand. You know the version. AGI empties his rifle, the clip pings, and a German or Japanese soldier crouched a few yards away hears it, understands exactly what it means. The American is empty, his rifle open, helpless for the 2 seconds it takes to reload, and rises up to kill him in the gap. It's the scene everyone remembers from Saving Private Ryan. It's on every gun store counter and forum on Earth. A brilliant rifle with one fatal flaw wired straight into its most distinctive feature. Except that isn't what happened. Start with the noise. A firefight is not a quiet place. It is the overlapping roar of rifles, machine guns, and artillery, the muzzle blast of the rifle itself, men screaming orders, the whole incomprehensible din of combat, and into that, you're asked to believe the enemy reliably picked out one small metallic ring from a single rifle and acted on it. At any distance past a few feet in a real fight, the ping simply drowns. Then the tactics. Soldiers did not fight as lone riflemen in silent duels, they fought in squads. When one man's rifle ran dry, the men beside him did not, and an enemy who popped up on the strength of a single ping was standing into the fire of everyone else. One empty rifle in a squad is not an empty position, it's bait. And then the record, the part that should settle it. Across 2 wars and more than 5 million rifles, there is no documented case of an American soldier killed because his Garand pinged. None. Not a credited combat report, not a pattern in the casualty files. The historians and veterans who have gone looking come back with nothing. The wartime army, which did notice and complain about the rifle's noisy safety catch, never once flagged the ping as a danger. One contemporary assessment even treated the sound as useful, not to the enemy, but to the man firing it, a built-in cue that it was time to reload. There's a legend that runs the other way too, that clever G.I.S. would toss an empty clip onto a rock to fake the ping and bait an enemy into showing himself. It's a better story, and it's just as thin, no more evidence for the ping as a trick than for the ping as a death sentence. Both are folklore. The truth is duller and stranger. The most famous flaw of the most famous American rifle is a flaw that, as far as anyone can prove, no one ever actually paid for. Be fair about it. In some freak moment, a silent night, two men a few feet apart, nothing else firing, could the sound have mattered once? It isn't physically impossible, and honest history doesn't pretend it is. But as a real, recurring liability across the whole war, the one thing everyone knows about the Garand turns out to be the one thing about it that isn't so. It survives not because it happened, but because it's a perfect little story, a tiny sound, a terrible price, and a good story outlives the facts every time. Which leaves the obvious question: if the famous flaw is a myth, did the M1 have any real weaknesses at all? It had two, and they're more interesting than the fake one. A channel that spends a whole segment tearing down the fake flaw owes you the real ones. The M1 had two. Neither is the one everyone talks about, and both are more honest. The first is buried in the very feature that produced the ping, that fixed internal magazine and its N-block clip. The Garand was, in the deepest sense, an all-or-nothing rifle. You could not quietly top it off. A soldier with a bolt action, or later with a box magazine, could push a few rounds back in behind cover and go over the top with a full weapon again. The Garand fought that idea. To reload it before it ran dry, you had to trip the catch, eject the partial clip, dumping live rounds into the mud or your pocket, and shove in a fresh 8. Clumsy in the calm, worse under fire, when your hands are shaking and fine motor skills are the first thing to desert you. And this is the part that makes it a real limit and not a nitpick. The ammunition itself came packed in 8-round clips. There were no loose rounds to top off with in the first place. To add 3, you'd have to break open a full clip and waste the rest. So the answer soldiers actually used was simple and a little grim. Shoot the rifle dry, hear the ping, load a fresh 8. Which is precisely why the ping existed to become a myth at all. The rifle was built to be run to empty. Its most famous sound and its most genuine weakness are the same design decision, seen from two sides. Be fair though, it was a modest flaw in practice. If the clip had truly hobbled the rifle, it would have shown in the vast combat of the Second World War, and it never did. Millions of men fought with it and won. The second flaw is larger, and it isn't really about the rifle at all, it's about timing. Remember the German squad, built around its machine gun, one answer to the firepower question, and one that outvolumed the American squad round for round. But the Germans went further. Partway through the war, they fielded a weapon that answered the rifle question itself. The Sturmgewehr, the first true assault rifle, select fire, fed from a 30-round detachable magazine, firing a shorter, intermediate cartridge. A man could actually hold on target on full automatic. That was the future of the infantry rifle. And the Garand, full-powered 8 rounds of hard-kicking 30-06 fired one pull at a time, was not it. That is not a fair charge to lay on a design from 1936. The intermediate cartridge idea barely existed yet, and no one builds tomorrow's weapon with yesterday's problem in front of him. But it frames what the Garand truly was. It was the finest example ever built of the full-power self-loading battle rifle, a whole category the assault rifle was about to make obsolete. You can watch it happen in the rifle's own bloodline. When the army finally retired the M1 in 1957, it chose the M14 die, essentially a Garand corrected, a detachable 20-round magazine, the ability to top off, select fire, a shorter cartridge. Every real flaw fixed, and the M14 lasted barely a decade. By 1967 it was gone, replaced by the M16, lighter, smaller bored, an assault rifle. The M14 became the last American battle rifle ever issued in quantity. The entire line the Garand crowned reached its peak, and its end inside a single generation. So the honest ledger reads like this. The M1 was not flawless. It fought you a little every time you reloaded it, and it was not the future. It was something rarer than either, the perfect final expression of an idea, arriving at the exact moment that idea ran out of road. Which is what makes the last word on it so strange, because the man who handed the M1 Garand its most famous verdict didn't hedge for a second. So what is the honest verdict on John Garand's rifle? Gather up everything we've found. It was not flawless. It fought your hands a little every time you reloaded it. It was not the future. The assault rifle was already being born, and the Garand's whole full-powered lineage would be gone inside a single generation. And its most famous flaw of all, the fatal ping, turns out on the evidence to be a myth no soldier ever actually paid for. Strip those away, and what's left is the thing that was true from the very first frame of this story, the arithmetic. In a world where every other great power still sent its infantry to war working a bolt by hand, the United States handed each of its riflemen a weapon that reloaded itself and let him fire 2 or 3 aimed shots for the enemy's one. Not a wonder weapon, not a war won by a rifle, a quiet, distributed, repeatable edge, one man's firepower roughly doubled, then multiplied across every squad in the largest army America ever put in the field. That was real, that mattered, and no other nation managed to put it into the hands of all its infantry. The self-loading service rifle was a problem the whole world had tried and abandoned as impractical, unreliable, too delicate, impossible to issue to millions of ordinary men. Garand spent 17 years proving the whole world wrong, and the last word on whether it was worth it came from a man who did not deal in gentle praise. On the 26th of January, 1945, with the war in its final winter, General George Patton, who had watched men live and die on exactly the margins this rifle changed, a second's hesitation, 3 rounds against 1, sat down and wrote to the Army's Chief of Ordnance. The first line of that letter has outlived almost everything else ever said about the M1. In my opinion, Patton wrote, "The M1 rifle is the greatest battle implement ever devised. The rifle every nation had given up on as impossible ended the war as the weapon the hardest fighting General America produced would call the greatest ever made." But there is one name that letter never mentions, and it's the one this whole story belongs to. John Garand never owned his rifle. As a civil service employee of the government's own armory, he couldn't hold the patents on the thing he had spent his life building, and beyond his salary, he never earned a single dollar from it. More than 5 million M1s were built before the last one left the line, 5 million rifles carrying his name, and not one of them paid him a cent. Congress tried more than once to vote him a lump sum of $100,000 for what he'd done. Every attempt died in procedural objection. It never came. He went on working at Springfield until he retired, and he died in 1974 in modest circumstances in the same Massachusetts town where he'd built the rifle. By every account, he carried none of it with bitterness. He was proud of what the thing had done, and he left it at that. So there are 2 verdicts on the M1 Garand, and you need both to have the truth. There is Patton's, the greatest battle implement ever devised, the rifle that gave every American soldier an edge the rest of the world never matched. And there is the quieter one, the one the legends always leave out, that behind the most famous American weapon of the century stood a Canadian-born toolmaker who solved the impossible, handed it to his country, and asked for nothing back. The rifle got the general's verdict. The man got a government paycheck and a quiet grave. Remember both. And now a question for you. Somewhere in this video, something you were sure you knew about the M1 probably came apart. The ping that never killed anyone, the general who bought a better cartridge and then killed it, the number 8 that was really a budget decision in disguise. So tell me in the comments, which one got you? Which fact overturned something you'd believed for years? The best of them I read and remember. And this channel gets sharper for every correction and every story the rest of you bring to it.